Good evening to you all, and thanks for being here. My name is Ron Smith. I'm Vice President for Research here at the university, and I'm here tonight on behalf of President Neil Smastrick, who said, he just walked away from me and said, do this, to welcome you to the Brookings Scholar Lecture Series, which is truly one of the many community benefits of having the Brookings Mountain West initiative here at UNLV. You have the pleasure tonight of hearing from the Executive Director of Brookings Mountain West, and that's Bill Antholis, Dr. Bill Antholis, who is also the Managing Director of the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. What that all means is he's a very important person to us, and I will tell you, too, he's a really terrifically nice guy, and he had trouble finding a babysitter. And from 300 miles away, I was able to help him a little bit this weekend. He found someone, although I just hope pray she's not a crack addict or something like that. But at any rate, this is our 6th lecture in the new Brookings Scholar Lecture Series. Each visit by a Brookings Scholar also features interaction with our faculty, our students, and community leaders. And in fact, that contact is already leading to some excellent networking and future research collaborations. In January, the 2 research directors for Brookings Mountain West, Rob Lang here in Las Vegas and Mark Muro in Washington, D.C., will more actively continue their research work on the Mountain Metro's portion of the Brookings Mountain West agenda. The visits by the Brookings Scholars give us opportunity to bring lessons learned nationally and internationally and apply them locally, while Rob and Mark's work will in turn allow us to export regional findings to a national and international audience. And without any further delay or really bad jokes on my part, let me welcome law professor Brett Birdsong to the stage to introduce Dr. Antholis, along with Sajjad Ahmad of our Department of Civil and Electrical Engineering, and they are serving as our official host for Dr. Antholis during his visit. Brett, it's all yours.
Thank you. It is my pleasure tonight to welcome to UNLV, as part of the Brookings UNLV Mountain West program, Dr. William Antholis, who, as Dr. Smith mentioned, is a high-level Washington muckety-muck, managing director of the Brookings Institution, as well as director of the Brookings Mountain West project. So as the managing director of Brookings, Dr. Antholis was kind enough to tell the law faculty today he's got his fingers in all sorts of interesting policy work that's going on throughout the Brookings Institution, but he has really been a key player in making this UNLV-Brookings partnership happen. And he was here a couple of months ago to kick it off, and it's very nice to have him back talking about his area of policy expertise, which is climate change. Prior to joining Brookings, Dr. Antholis served in a number of very interesting positions in Washington and elsewhere. He, among other things, was Director of Studies and a Senior Fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. He also, at the German Marshall Fund, was a project director for the Trade and Poverty Forum, which was a dialogue of leading citizens and legislators from throughout the world, the U.S., the European Union, Japan, India, Brazil, and South Africa. Before that, he worked for the United States government as part of the National Security Council and the National Economic Council. He was also, during the Kyoto climate negotiations, Deputy Director of the White House Office on Climate Change Policy, or their policy team at Kyoto. Earlier in his career, he'd worked in the State Department in the Policy Planning Office. He was a fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, and last and certainly not least, because it's my alma mater, he was a visiting fellow at Princeton University. So I am very happy to introduce Bill, who got his PhD in political science from Yale and his BA from the University of Virginia. In introducing the talk tonight, which is titled Double-Edged Sovereignty, the Politics of Diplomacy and Climate Change. I should say that I called Bill a few weeks ago to introduce myself as faculty liaison, and around then it had become clear that the Senate here was not going to be able to move on any sort of climate change legislation, and everyone was saying that the prospects for a big deal in Copenhagen were dead, and I said to Bill, what were you going to talk about on the eve of the Copenhagen talks if the prospects are dead? He basically said, well, it's good in a sense that they're dead, at least the prospects for a big deal. And I kind of probed about that for a while. We're going to hear a little bit about why he might think so. And now, I guess, with the last week, with President Obama suggesting targets for the U.S., with China coming out with targets and emissions reductions for China, I would say that the chances for something in Copenhagen might now be undead, but they're a semblance maybe of their former selves. And I think Bill, again, would say, good. And that's really the topic of tonight's lecture. I'm very much looking forward to hearing what you have to say about it, and I'd like to welcome you up to the podium. Thanks, Dr. Antholis.
Well, it's terrific to be here. Is this mic on? Yes. It's terrific to be back. It was just a few months ago that we were here to kick it off, and in that talk, I played the role of my real job at Brookings was to be a jack of all trades and master of none. We have this index that we do called the How We're Doing Index, which spans across the institution, pulling together data from all of our different enterprises. Tonight I'm going to talk about something that I pretend to be an expert on from time to time, which is climate change. But I should warn people here that I'm not an economist, I'm not a scientist. My job in the climate change negotiations, starting with 12 and a half years ago when I was thrown onto the Kyoto team, I like to say I was traded for a roll of stamps and a box of paper clips from the economic policy team, was to be the jack of all trades in that process. What I tried to do then, and what I'm still trying to do now on this issue, is just to try to track and map what former Democratic Majority Leader in the House of Representatives, Dick Kephart, once called the most complicated political transaction in the history of mankind. And I believe that to be a true statement about this. We're talking about a legislative undertaking in the United States that is as complex as the healthcare legislation that we're all watching, times 192 countries. Essentially, it's going to require that level of interaction across the entire planet. There are ways of breaking it down to make it easier, and I'm going to talk about that tonight as well. But so frame number one in your mind should be the most complicated political transaction in the history of mankind. Frame number two is the phrase that I said at lunch today, which is a half a loaf is better than a full loaf on this issue. And I'll come to why that is. Not better than no loaf, but actually better than a full loaf. So the basics of climate change. Again, I'm not a scientist, but the most important thing to think about is that in a minor variation of the world's temperature, caused by whatever it's caused by, we're seeing this happening. These are glaciers in South America, outside Bariloche in Argentina. And you can see the difference from 1928 to 2004. And this is happening all over the planet. And most importantly, it's happening at the polar ice caps, north and south, much more at the north, a little bit less at the south. But it's also happening on the so-called third ice cap, which is the glaciers in the Himalayas and other smaller glaciers elsewhere. And the reason that this is so critical, regardless of what's causing it, is that as these various packs of cold, of frozen water melt, two things happen. One is the ability to reflect heat back into the outer atmosphere is diminished. And two, particularly in the North and South Pole, as water is exposed, that water absorbs heat. And what could happen by 2050 is if scientists are, if the massive wealth of scientific information is correct, is that that would fundamentally change weather patterns on the planet, affecting agriculture, affecting water, and as you all know here, that could have dramatic impacts on places across the planet. From a public policy perspective, you always start with where is the public on any particular issue. And I'm going to start here with the U.S. domestic, but this is a domestic U.S. politics issue as much as it is around the planet. And in the U.S., awareness has increased pretty significantly. If you look at, this is where I came to the issue 12 years ago, and we've gone from 60% to 80% since Kyoto. But the public is not really worried about it. This measures how much people really worry about climate change a great deal. And if you go back to, we've gone up 13 points, but we haven't gone up 20 points. And so it's a lagging, the public concern is not as high, or the real need to act, the feeling of the need to act is not as high as the awareness of the issue. As a result, what you see is people thinking that warming is a serious problem, but not as many people wanting immediate action. And that causes a political lag in the United States. Now again, things have improved dramatically, and when we talk about different sovereignty dimensions, we have to get the United States, if we think that this is a problem and that reducing carbon emissions, which scientists believe is the greatest thing driving the change in temperature, it requires federal action. What we have seen is in the last 12 years, a number of states have completed climate action plans. Now, what a climate action plan is varies pretty dramatically from state to state. Sometimes that means passing comprehensive cap-and-trade legislation, which has happened in a few states. In other states, it simply means encouraging renewables or things like that. But this is an enormous sign of progress in 12 years. At the federal level, as we move towards comprehensive cap-and-trade legislation, we've passed it in the House of Representatives, it's ready to go to the Senate. The action is all in the Senate. And in the current state of bipartisanship, as one Senate Democrat said to me recently, bipartisanship now means getting the left side of the Democratic Party to agree with the right side of the Democratic Party, and that's still really hard to do. So what that means is getting Barbara Boxer and John Kerry and Tom Harkin, who has a real interest in biofuels, to start working with Bob Byrd, whose coal interests, in the House, John Dingell, and also in the Senate, Mary Landrieu, who have real energy or energy-consuming interests in their state to work with one another. This is no easy feat. And the key person in that is somebody that lives pretty close to here. I've been to Searchlight, and I know where it is. But I know he has an office not too far from here, and he also has an office not too far from where my other office is. The real challenge for these folks are these people in the middle. In these 9 senators lies the future of climate change legislation. Just to sum up, you have to get 60 votes in the Senate now to break a filibuster. There are probably 48 Democrats solidly in favor on action on climate change. There are 2 Democrats who I showed in the last slide who are likely to oppose anything, Mary Landrieu and Bob Byrd. These people have indicated that they might be willing to act, but they essentially, focused in those states, are looking for things that will make the cost of action much less great. And they're also worried on a different sovereignty dimension, not just about our action vis-a-vis our states, but how we play against other actors, and we'll come back to that. So if you take 48 and you add 9, that's only going to get you to 57. But there are some Republicans that could be part of the game. The most recent is Lindsey Graham, who wrote a very famous now famous op-ed with John Kerry saying that he's willing to support comprehensive cap-and-trade legislation if it includes provisions for nuclear and for offshore drilling. And there is now a huge scramble going on to see if those provisions could be put in place in a way that allows a bill to happen. There are 2 senators from Maine who have become part of any effort at bipartisan legislation, Olympia Snowe and Susan Collins, and they're quite likely to be in a proactive mode on this issue. Senator Dick Lugar on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee is the ranking Republican, has been very proactive in saying that the United States needs to take this on as a leadership issue. And then there's Senator John McCain, who was the path-breaking Republican in saying that this is an issue of national concern, should be a bipartisan issue, in his presidential run supported a bill very much like the one that was passed in Waxman-Markey in the House, but now appears to be backing away from climate legislation. Unclear where he's going to go in the process. But essentially, Democrats need to get 3, if not 4, of these people on board. And if they get 5, then they can offset somebody that they might lose in that 9-member process. By the way, I want to apologize for this white line across the screen. I've lost my research assistant to the flu. I couldn't figure out how to get rid of it, so it appears in all these slides. The thing that is going to bring on those Senate Republicans is a strong national security argument for acting on clean energy plus climate change. So as you listen to the Senate debate, you will hear reference to this gentleman, this gentleman, this gentleman, and this one. Let me focus for a minute on Putin, because on the one hand, he is not an outspoken enemy of the United States in the way that at least 2 of these fellows are, and perhaps a third, Chavez. But Russia's role in this process and Russia's role in global diplomacy has been such that it's raised even greater attention in the United States to why energy security is important. To the extent that we remain dependent on fossil fuels, particularly the import of foreign oil, it makes countries that produce and export that oil all the more powerful. But there's another argument that will be made in bringing over both moderate Democrats and conservative Republicans, or all Republicans that might support the issue, and that's the competitiveness claim. As you all know, here on the solar industry, which is just kicking up in the United States, this is an industry that we are behind. There is an argument to be made that one of the next competitive industries in the United States is taking a leadership role in renewable sources of energy, and we're losing that battle right now. As we move from a domestic conversation about climate change to an international one, the word Kyoto is going to come up time and time again. Remember, when we went off to negotiate Kyoto, a Senate resolution had already passed unanimously, 97-0, that the United States should not negotiate a treaty that undermined our economic competitiveness or hurt us with respect to jobs in our economy. Essentially, India and China had to take on the same kind of commitments that the United States was willing to take on at Kyoto, or the Senate was going to reject the treaty. And that was passed 97-0. So including the support of a lot of Democrats and those of us in the Clinton administration said at the time, with friends like that, you know, what are we doing here? The structure of that agreement was that we were going to go out and negotiate a treaty and then come back and ratify it. There was a clear divide between rich and poor countries at the time. Essentially, the Kyoto framework included 2 kinds of countries, Annex 1 and Annex B. I always like to do the list where you go 1, 2, C. We actually, in the Kyoto Treaty, there was an Annex 1 and there was an Annex B. Annex 1 were industrial countries. Annex B were developing countries. And developing countries not only did not have to take on a binding target, they were prohibited from doing so unless the entire conference of the party, that is all the 192 countries that come to the negotiations, agreed that they could do so. So even as some developing countries have tried to step forward and take on a binding target, the Kyoto process actually prohibits them from doing so. So one of the things that we'll come back to is whether or not that stands. And it involved all 192 countries. The major players at Kyoto was the EU, who both had a leadership role and a luck role, and I'll come back to that in a second. The United States, we were bounded in our leadership. The Byrd-Hagel resolution that passed 97-0 essentially told us what we could and couldn't negotiate without the administration having much to say in that. And the developing countries, as I said, were put on hold. They didn't have to do anything. What I mean by, I want to focus on Europe for a second because it cuts at this sovereignty issue in an interesting way. This map shows Europe's performance against its Kyoto pledge. The green countries here are ones that are going to meet their Kyoto target. The yellow one are countries that will meet their Kyoto target using flexibility mechanisms. These are emission trading mechanisms where if they weren't going to meet their target, they could go out and buy credit for reducing targets from other places, particularly developing countries, where those emissions could be reduced a lot cheaper. These were things that the United States insisted on, including in Kyoto. We were able to get it against European opposition, and now Europe's taking advantage of that, and we are not part of the arrangement. And then there are the countries that will not meet their Kyoto targets regardless. when I say luck, Europe has had two lucky things going for it in coming close to complying with Kyoto. First, Germany, Britain, and France took on very ambitious emission reduction targets against a 1990 baseline. The Kyoto process was Europe agreed to go 8% below its 1990 levels. The US agreed to go 7%. Japan agreed to go 6% below. But within Europe, each country took on its own target that it would then meet, and that was all blended together to come up with that 8% figure. The UK took on a 20% reduction target. Germany took on a 20% reduction target. France took on a 20% reduction target. They were able to make those targets, or in the case of France, may make those targets using these other mechanisms, only because they had done things after 1990 but before 1997 that dramatically reduced their emissions profile. East Germany collapsed with the collapse of their economy, collapsed a lot of their emissions. The UK had shut down its coal mines under Margaret Thatcher as a way of breaking the coal union, essentially, and switching to natural gas. And France went nuclear in a very dramatic way. So Europe took on a baseline and a target that was very advantageous for us, and essentially gamed early in the negotiations in the 1995 period, gamed the United States into a benchmark that's different. So what you will see in the run-up to Copenhagen is the US using a different benchmark, a 2005 baseline that American negotiators feel is more fair. And then the second lucky thing that happened to Europe is that one was this, and two was that they were able to adopt the mechanisms, these trading mechanisms that the US had negotiated for and then walked away from. And so places like France, when they saw that even with having 80% of their power be nuclear, they were still not going to meet their reduction target, they were able to go to Brazil and pay Brazilians to protect their forest as a way of earning emissions credit, or to go to China and convert a very dirty coal plant into a less dirty coal plant and take those credits back home. So in the run-up to Copenhagen, you're going to see a structure that's very different from this. Essentially, based on the experience of the last 12 years, the United States in particular, but other countries, are first going to try to pass domestic legislation before negotiating a binding international agreement. That's a major inversion of the way we used to do global governance agreements. Essentially, it takes domestic sovereignty as the starting point and then comes back to how you use that the power of sovereign passed domestic law to negotiate a treaty that is internationally binding on our international sovereignty. There are now three sets of countries in the game. There are industrial countries. There are these emerging countries, China and India and Brazil, who have experienced dramatic GDP growth in the last 12 years. And then there are the really poor countries that are still facing the great burden, the impacts of climate change. And then there's the UN process that has 192 countries, but then on the side of that, there has been a set of negotiations that breaks it down so that it's not quite the complicated game that I said before. There are about 17 countries out there that account for about 90% of the global emissions. And those countries have been having shadow negotiations trying to close the difference. But again, they won't try to complete those negotiations until major legislation is passed in the big players. Going through the players, the EU now has the experience of having seen how important these trading mechanisms are, and that experience will be built into the negotiations. The US is expressing cautious leadership. As we heard before, President Obama is now going to go to Copenhagen, is going to come in with a target. The target is based on the legislation that's already passed in the House of Representatives. But he won't commit in a legally binding way to that until he's able to first come back home and pass domestic legislation. And then the major industrializing emerging countries will be coming in with their own set of interests. In the past, they wanted to simply not be involved in this. But China realizes that this is a branding moment for them. They are now the world's biggest emitter. We'll come to that in a second. India realizes that it's branded itself internationally as being the leading edge of technology development in the world. And it doesn't want to go back to an old third world versus first world mentality, because that will undercut its efforts to brand itself as an emerging high-tech player. And Brazil and Indonesia see, based on the experience of countries like France going and buying emission target, that there's real cash in this for them if the agreement's structured in the right way. So it's a very, over 12 years, a lot has changed. There is the enormous domestic support that we're starting to see in the United States that, again, hasn't led to a fully dramatic feeling like we need to act now, but at least a greater openness to it. And that same thing is happening in developing countries. So again, I'm an optimist here in seeing the glass at least half full. There are still really difficult issues out there, and in the remaining part of the talk, I'm going to just focus on a couple of them, but I want to list the issues because you'll hear about them over the next 2 weeks. First is mitigation, and not just the idea of reducing our emissions, but having it done in an equitable way. And there are two dimensions of that. One is targets and timetables. These are the concrete commitments that industrial countries are likely to make. And then there is reporting and review. This is what developing countries are likely to do. Since developing country emissions are likely to still continue to grow, they're not yet at the point where they're talking about the same emission reductions. And I'll come back to this in a minute. There's also the enforcement of these agreements. As we said, if you look back at that map on the US domestic side, we're still groping our way toward 50 state-level plans for acting. And if anybody here is a student of American federalism, you'll know that the federal-state set of debates on these issues has always been pretty difficult. Again, imagine walking that through. We talked about how in Europe they have a different set of targets, each within their own countries, that they then smooth out into the European bubble. India is an enormous federation. China is an enormous federation. Russia is an enormous federation. This same set of debates is going on within these countries. So to establish an enforcement agreement among those countries that takes into account the domestic level arguments is an important undertaking that is just beginning, and I don't expect to be completed at Copenhagen. There are another set of issues that I won't discuss here, but just so that you know that they're out there. One is how forests are accounted for. 20% of emissions in the world come from the cutting of forests and the loss of carbon sequestration that happens when a tree absorbs carbon out of the atmosphere. It's as important to addressing the climate as all transportation emissions around the world. And that's big on the agenda at Copenhagen. Adaptation. Poor countries in particular are feeling the impacts of climate change already. I know people here in Nevada are feeling the impacts of climate change. How countries that are suffering from climate change that haven't contributed to the problem are accounted for in this process is a very contentious issue, particularly for small island states that by 2050 might be completely inundated and covered. And then the financing of a number of these different things internationally is a big complicated issue, as is technology transfer. If we develop low carbon technology in the United States, for poorer countries, can they have access to that? It goes to intellectual property rights. Again, very complicated stuff we can come back to in the Q&A. I want to go through just the top two on these, which is the equity set of issues and the enforcement set of issues. One way to think about equity is simply what kind of impact we're having on the climate. This is the current emissions, CO2 in million megatons of emissions. China is now the leader, the United States closely behind. But you can see India at 1.5 is quickly catching up and is going to soon surpass Russia. But you can also take this and look per capita what those emissions are, and there you see a very different picture. The Chinese and the Indians will say, well, yeah, we're the biggest emitters, but we have 3 times as many people as you. And the Indians in particular will say, you're emitting 15 or 16 times the amount per person as us. Don't tell us to reduce our emissions, particularly since you've been contributing to this problem for much longer than us. But the situation gets much more complex if you start looking at what they call energy intensity. So what you see here is per capita emissions, per capita GDP. So, we're roughly $50,000 per person versus China, $3,000 a person. What this represents is the amount of carbon emissions per $1,000 of GDP. And what China essentially announced in terms of their own target is to start lowering this number so that it's back closer to industrial country standards. There is a way to argue about climate change that says it's bad to produce anything in your economy because that leads to carbon emissions. And if you look at things in the bigger, broader picture, we're all wanting our GDPs to grow, not shrink. And so you don't want to penalize growth. What you want to reward is the right kind of energy efficient growth. So rather than moving towards a global standard on per capita emissions, a number of us are saying the right benchmark should be the energy intensity of our economies. And that India and China should be trying to drive this number down in much more of a European or Japanese or, again, Brazilian rate. One of the reasons Brazil is so energy efficient is it has enormous hydro, and it also has the potential to lock in those carbon sinks in their forests. Again, just to give you a sense of how India and China are growing, this is their emissions trajectory through 2020. This is roughly where we are now. China is at a little over 6, but by the end of next year, people expect them to get to 8. That's how quickly they're growing. And by 2020, even with a lot of energy efficiency coming online in China, likely to grow to that. Just to give you a sense right now, so by 2020, we're talking about 12 million megatons of emissions from India and China together. Right now in the world, there's about 27 million megatons of emissions a year. So by 2020, we're going to be talking about half of the current emissions just coming from India and China. So as we start bringing our numbers down, they're going to be picking up. And the real question is between 2020 and 2050, how India and China can start sloping that number down. And that really goes back to them improving their energy intensity. That's the equity of mitigation. I want to talk about enforcement. Right now, the EU kind of has domestic law on climate change. As we mentioned, there are all those different countries. There is not a single uniform domestic law. The hope in Europe in the next 3 or 4 years is to get a common law across the European Union, which still does not exist. But each of their countries does have a binding law of one kind or another. Again, they vary quite considerably. Japan does have a binding law. It hasn't been a particularly effective one. They're going to miss their Kyoto obligations. No other country has a binding law on climate change. I think that's really important to understand going into Copenhagen, where a lot of criticism will come on the United States for not having signed on to Kyoto. We're not as far behind as people think, and there is a good news story to tell there. We actually have a very similar view of how to negotiate international treaties to most of the other countries coming to the table. The two outliers being the EU and Japan, which is a result of a number of things, in particular their World War II experience, where they saw UN sanctions, particularly places like Germany, UN sanctions as a thing to drive positive change domestically. We don't view things that way. We view that as, you know, black helicopters and blue helmets. But the true story here is that China also views the UN in the same way, and India also views the UN in the same way, as does Brazil. They're very, very cautious about doing something and committing to something internationally that they haven't done domestically first. And so what you will hear a lot of them talking about is the domestic actions that they're already taking and are likely to take. Again, they haven't passed domestic law yet, but they're moving in that direction. If I put a map up here of the globe that was similar to the US of domestic action plans on climate change, all of these countries in the developing world would have one, which goes beyond countries, states in the United States that don't have them, like, you know, Alabama and Mississippi. As you can see, several countries did take binding targets at Kyoto. We negotiated one, but the Bush administration unsigned it, which was a new step in American diplomacy. Russia, as far as I know, there had not been another treaty that the United States had signed but then was walked away from before. We have a number of treaties that we haven't submitted to ratification, but no one has ever unsigned a treaty, got an eraser out, literally. Russia has signed on to a binding commitment, but Russia's commitment was quite interesting. Like Eastern Europe, their carbon economy collapsed after 1990. So Russia accepted a commitment to keep their emissions level with their where their 1990 emissions had been. But as a result of the collapse of communism, their emissions are actually still well below 1990 levels. So it was binding in a legal sense, but in an actual sense, that emission level was never fully binding on them. It was not as if they met a limit that they needed to come down from. They could simply rise back up to the limit that they had accepted. As a result, they didn't have to pass domestic legislation because they didn't have to do any reducing. None of these countries, as I mentioned before, took binding targets. And so the question going into Copenhagen is, what does the word binding mean? China will not take on a binding target at Copenhagen. They won't take one on in the next year after that. This may end up being a problem in getting those 9 Democratic senators and 3 or 4 Republicans to support the agreement, but it's simply not going to happen, and anybody that has an expectation that it will is, I think, a bit deluded. The question is, will they start to do things that look like what we ourselves have been willing to say that we're going to do? Pass domestic legislation first, and then come back in some future negotiation and accept a binding agreement based on it. That same thing applies to India. Brazil may actually have something that looks more like a binding target, and the reason for that is they really want to sell their forests. That is, they want to sell the protection of their forests. And if being part of a binding arrangement helps them to do that, they will do it. They understand the cash value of what they have, and they want to monetize it. Russia is going to be in the same situation the next time around as they were in the last time around. And for the United States, this raises the question of what does our commitment to a binding target mean? For me, the model on what a binding target should mean is not the World Trade Organization as the thing that enforces binding trade rules and has not been doing so very well in the 10 years since it was created, but the thing that preceded it for 50 years, which is the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which was binding in a much softer way. Essentially, it was based in domestic law, and what it did was ratchet up ambition and allow countries to first do domestic legislation on liberalizing their trade barriers, and then come back to the international negotiating table and increasingly match the international system to the domestic one that they had established. And it set up an enforcement mechanism that allowed countries to essentially resolve disputes in a way that countries took on their own sanctions when they came to understand that they had violated something. My sense of what the next 2 years in terms of establishing a binding agreement is going to be is going to take a political consensus around where national targets should be and set up a self-enforcing mechanism that is much more like the GATT system and much less like the WTO system. It took 50 years to build confidence in the GATT to get us to move to a WTO, and then the move to the WTO in some way, because it resembles hard law, shook the confidence of the members in it and also got protesters out in the street about the erosion of American sovereignty. So that's the basic framework that I take in looking at this. Again, I think that the glass, we should view this as a glass half full, and that half full is better than completely full. We're not in a position, based on our domestic law and practice, to take advantage of a fully binding international system. There is a big climate crisis screaming out there for action, but my fear is that if we run too quickly to act on it, we're not going to be in shape to be able to sustain the race that we need to in order to address the challenge at hand. So with that, I'm happy to take questions.